All right. Hi, everyone. Are you guys ready for the closing talk today? Moving into our last session, we will have a really interesting topic. That's also the question I asked myself when I started working in Kubernetes release team 2 years ago. The talk we have today for our closing session will be what's in the name open source. And our speaker for the topic will be Phil Robb. He is the president of Ericsson Software Technology. So everyone, please give Phil a round of applause for his presentation today. And Phil, it's your time now.
Thank you very much. Last session of the day. All right, let's see if we can keep the energy going here. So I'm going to start off with something that has actually nothing to do with open source, kind of. Only because who in the audience has ever heard of Amy Webb? Raise your hand. Oh, there you go. Well, yeah, that's only because I told you earlier. Okay. This is a really interesting resource. I find it profoundly interesting. Every year, this person, she runs an organization called the Future Today Strategy Group. She presents at South by Southwest every year. She just did a presentation earlier this week. It's on YouTube. Again, pull down the slides. You can find these, or just look up Amy Webb and Future Today. They put out a report that's literally 1,000 pages long, covering 15 major topics. The theme this year is actually the combination of artificial intelligence with advanced sensors, and they're really advanced, as well as bioengineering. And those three together basically are causing a tectonic shift in innovation. All of this has to relate, for me, back to what's going to be an open source in this space, what's going to be an open innovation in this space, because I'm a licensing wonk, how that actually works from a licensing and allowance standpoint. So I find every year when she comes out with this report, it to be really, really interesting. I just watched her thing this morning and I thought, you know what, I'm going to add this just so I can pass along this information. So there you go. A little bit about me. So been doing software since about 1983, a couple of regular application gigs, started doing networking for Honeywell in 87, Motorola in 89, interesting company called Unix Technology that was basically making Unix boxes look like IBM mainframes on SNA networks. Did a .com called Critical Path, joined Hewlett-Packard in 2001, and that's where I actually started working with open source. Ultimately formed and led their open source program office starting from about 2006. Left them to join the Linux Foundation because they were starting a bunch of networking projects, and again, I have an affinity towards networking. Was the VP of operations for that, joined Ericsson in 2019, and I plan on retiring in 2026 and becoming a boat captain. Also, as my role of leading this open source activity at Ericsson, I'm also a board member of the Linux Foundation, as well as a board member of the Open Infrastructure Foundation. And if you didn't catch the news earlier this week, Open Infrastructure Foundation announced that they are going to be merging with the Linux Foundation. So I'll be on one less board. That's great. But it will be a governing board then within the Linux Foundation. And finally, even though I have all those affiliations, this talk is really my personal views, and I don't represent any of those foundations, nor my employer in this particular talk. So, when I started in open source, the term was generally known to mean permissionless use, have a particular set of user freedoms, and also frictionless collaborative development. It meant all three of those together. So back in the early 2000s when we were working, that was the assumption. And from a standard and cultural norm aspect, that's what it looked like. So permissionless is really interesting and important if you work in a company, because what that has always meant to me is that it meant that you didn't have to go to the sourcing organization to figure out the contract if you could use this piece of software that you pulled down off of the internet or not. And that was the big difference, right? So in the generic sense, permissionless means you can take it and use it and share, modify, study, and so forth without getting any permission from the author. But more importantly, inside of a company, it meant that it's been around long enough and the lawyers in that company know enough about open source definition that if a license complies with the OSI, then it's, in general, safe to use. Now, GPL has a particular set of restrictions or obligations, rather, associated with it, so you have to explain to the developers when and how you use that, but otherwise, it's not something that goes through sourcing. User freedoms, so again, and I hope I'm not beating too much of a dead horse, pardon the US colloquialism, but I've seen several talks today talking about the fact that use, study, modify, and share are very important user freedoms that are associated with open source software. And we've understood those to mean that for a long, long time. And it's very important for how you have autonomy and the ability to use this code. And then, again, from a cultural norm standpoint, it also meant frictionless collaborative development, right? The benefit of being able to work with open source software is that you're usually in a community of like-minded individuals and organizations trying to accomplish some common set of goals. And that's really important because of the network effect. And I see two network effects that happen inside of open source ecosystems. First is the user network effect, and this is the same as why is Facebook so valuable? It's so valuable because there are so many people on it. If there weren't anybody on it, it wouldn't be valuable. So it's that network, it's the ability to engage and have others around. It works the same way with open source code as a user because it often means interoperability, it means compatibility. The reason open source is so much more effective than standards are because even if there's a bug in the standard, you're using the same set of code, and so it just works. I remember back in my early networking days, we used to buy networking stacks from third-party companies, right? Honeywell and Motorola bought the same networking stack from some third-party company, and they specialized in TCP/IP stacks. And the reason you bought from them was because TCP/IP specs weren't perfect, but if you used the same code from the same third-party vendor, it just always worked. And so it was just easier to do that. But when open source came along, there was no longer a need to have that third-party vendor because we just all built it in open source. So user network effects are important. Developer network effects are important, but in a different way with open source. So developer network effects happen when different users with different use cases come and use the same technology and add the piece that they need. I used to always tell the story of, when I started off in computers, and we moved from minis to PCs, and then PCs and beyond, you didn't use the same operating system from one type of machine to the next, right? There were mainframes, they had an operating system. You had minis and that had Unix often, as well as VMS. And then you had PCs that had MS-DOS, right? And none of those were the same. And when MS-DOS and the hardware around PCs got better, it took forever to get past 1 megabit, or 1 megabyte rather, of memory, if you remember those days, right? Or when multi-core came along, or 64-bit processors came along. Those took forever to actually evolve inside the software because it was always trailing the hardware. But with Linux, when we had Android phones in your pocket go to multi-core and 64-bit, it was there immediately because that same operating system was being used in very large systems and ultimately in supercomputers. Similarly, when all of the small footprint companies, individual IoT devices as well as phones, they needed a small footprint, small memory, very efficient power usage. Well, that wasn't very important to the server organizations or companies who were running large servers, but when data centers got to be more and more prolific, it became really interesting and important to those supercomputer folks when all of the p-states that existed inside of the Linux kernel to be able to manage power, saving lots and lots of money by shutting down and slowing down the processors with lower states of power usage because the machine was under less of a load. So point being is areas of innovation for one class of users ends up over time becoming really interesting and important to other classes of users. And that's a network effect from a development standpoint. And so it's different. But these are some of the huge values that come with the way that open source has evolved and what it actually brings to us as a society. Over these last 25 years, though, that has begun to be diminished. And over the last few years, that is also gaining increased pace. So permission to use is now required on some of these new licenses. Organizations like HashiCorp, like Elastic, like Redis, they'll make statements that say, well, this is really an open source license. It's just limiting people from competing with us. Well, as you've heard in other talks, or at least I have today, that's stopping a usage. That's stopping a particular type of organization. So it's not open source. And that's an extremely important differentiation to make. Similarly, there was a time back, particularly in the early aughts or mid-aughts of the century, where a way of getting around this having to provide source code, they would provide source code, but they would obfuscate it. They would run it through an obfuscator that would turn all of the variable names into single letters. And from one version of their release to the next, they'd change the obfuscator so the variables weren't the same, right? So it was extremely difficult to reverse engineer from source code. Technically, they were doing what they were supposed to be doing, right? That ultimately got shut down, but that's the type of loopholes that organizations will try to find in our ecosystem. Now we have the problem of challenging in collaboration as well as refusal to collaborate. So like I said, a network effect in the development of an open source project is very helpful when that project takes contributions from diverse sets of users. But we have both reasons, one of commercial interest, where organizations, if you've ever tried to actually collaborate with Google on their latest release of Android, you really shouldn't bother, because that's not what they do. It's open source software. The user has those permissions, but they're not interested in collaborating as a community. And that's just something that has always been part of the Android ecosystem. We also have, because we have so many different open source projects, many of which are run by literally individuals that aren't employed to do that maintenance work, they actually don't have the time. They don't have the time or the space to do PR reviews, to keep up with all of the management associated with managing a community. So that's diminishing the usefulness of that project, not to the fault of the maintainer. They just need help. I go to many, many different events where one of the major themes, including the Linux events, where the Linux maintainers are burnt out. Maintainer burnout in Linux is a real thing. It's not as though they're not getting paid to do Linux work, but they're usually getting paid to do features for the company they work for, not review other people's PRs, not maintaining the project as a manager. And so they do that on their nights and weekends. And that's great, because they're passionate about the project. They want to do that for their community for a year or two, right? But now they've done it for a decade or two, and they're getting kind of tired. This is a problem with our ecosystem that we need to fix. It's not their fault, but it is something that now since society is so dependent on all of this software, these are collective problems we have to figure out together. So if we map this, I've got, along the top here, I've got free and open source software with collaborative development intent, then with challenged development, with restricted development, free and open source software with no collaborative development, as well as source available, the new licenses that are coming out from Redis and organizations like that, and then where we've always just been with freeware. User protections, copyleft, it's actually questionable, because without a license like a GPL license that requires each user in the chain down the stream has the same rights as those before it, then actually that user protections don't really work in open source at all, except in those type of copyleft licenses. And that's one dimension of collaboration that is often not seen, right? We collaborate together in an upstream, but we don't ensure freedoms for the users downstream. So when you see the Free Software Foundation, who has also come out with an AI ML license, and you hear them talk about what ideologically they're trying to protect, I fully appreciate that. And the Apache license is the most prevalent that we have in our ecosystem today, and it doesn't do that cascading of rights down through the users. It's usually the case that an organization takes it from upstream, they make modifications, they add it to their proprietary product. It's valuable to the ecosystem in that sense, but it doesn't continue to proliferate downstream. Permission limitless use, again, is definitely good in all of the free and open source licenses, as well as is the ability to use, study, modify, and share. And then, like I said, frictionless collaboration. The license isn't really what is driving that. It's the culture and the ability of the community to support that collaborative ecosystem. That's something that, like I said, I think as an as an ecosystem, we should be working really hard to preserve. Finally, open source AI. We've also heard a lot about that throughout this set of meetings, or throughout this week. I personally like the model open framework because it has 3 different classifications. One of the things I just wanted to call out in this talk was when we talk about data, got to have open data, and we need open data. Recognize that a lot of that data is intellectual property owned by somebody else. It's a book that somebody wrote. It's a movie that somebody did. It's a song somebody wrote. And while it's not copyright infringement for an AI to come up with something that sounds remarkably similar to something else but doesn't actually copy it note for note in a song or word for word in a book, it still diminishes that original author's uniqueness, their ability to continue to make money and provide their own revenue through their intellectual property. Right, so there's a balance that we have to come out here with. The model open framework, its highest classification is this open science, and the thing that most people have an issue with is it says data sets, any licensed or unlicensed. So you have to identify the data that was used to create your model, but you might have to, if somebody wants to reproduce it, they might have to pay royalties for that data to be able to use that same data set to create something that is identical. I think that's fair. I think that's reasonable. Again, there are others, certainly at this event, that disagree with me. But this is a battle that's raging on, and as I was watching that Amy Webb presentation this morning, we're taking 3 years to figure out what we want to call open source AI, and if you watch that video, there's a whole bunch of other stuff that's coming down the pike, and we're not keeping pace. You know, we're not keeping pace in what we think is or is not open source, and so the regulators that are trying to come on behind us and figure this out, they don't have a foundation from which to start to build regulations either. So we have to get faster. Then finally, in conclusion, so conventional software, it's the other difference between conventional software and artificial intelligence. Conventional software is a deterministic system where we know where the intellectual property comes from, and we know what is being given away and who gave it away, and they did it on purpose, right? Data in AI is intellectual property owned by somebody else, usually many others, and requiring all data to be open, I can't see as being fair or realistic. And without all that data, it is impossible to adequately study a probabilistic AI system, but you can refine it from there going forward. So foundational models that are open weights, they aren't perfect, and it would be really good if you could regenerate, but that doesn't mean that they are of no value. They are of a diminished value, but as I've tried to show in this talk, we got a lot of different things in the open source ecosystem that is of diminished value, but is still of value. And that's really all I wanted to say. I probably ran over time anyway, I did. So, there you go. Thank you.